Hi, I'm Steve Pincus from the University of Chicago. I'm going to be talking about the global British Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries and trying to explain why it was that Britain gained an empire in South Asia at the same time that it lost one in British North America. So the central question that I want to answer, that I'm trying to answer in the book, is why did Britain gain an empire in South Asia at the same time that it lost one in North America between the 1760s and the 1780s? And here, just to give you a sense, right, I mean, there's a map of British North America. I was sort of struggling to find a map which didn't imagine British North America as only the future 13 colonies, but there it is, and there's what became British South Asia by the early 19th century. But there's a sort of subsidiary question that I'm interested in as well, which sort of runs throughout the book and throughout the introduction, is why was the British Empire an empire so full of contradictions? Why, for example, are the world's two largest democracies, India and the United States, why are they both former British colonies, but planters and merchants throughout the British Empire enslaved and transported over 3 million people from Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries, right? I mean, chattel slavery seems to be about as undemocratic a thing as you could possibly imagine. The growth of colonial consumption made it possible for Britain to become the first industrial nation. That's, I suppose, a controversial statement, the first part of it. The second part, that Britain became the first industrial nation, not so controversial. But Britain also, so it developed, also suppressed the development of the world's most advanced textile production in India. So at the same time that it became the first industrial nation, it suppressed textile production elsewhere. So sort of an underlying theme of one of the central questions for me is why these contradictions, and that needs to be answered. So I want to suggest that the kind of dominant modes, the dominant ways of interpreting the British Empire in the period can't explain either the sort of empirical question, why lose North America by gaining India, or these kind of puzzling contradictions. There's what I call a sort of neoliberal interpretation, which insists that Britain had a weak and permissive imperial state in the 17th and 18th century. That can't explain why Britain lost its colonies or the persistence of chattel slavery, right? If the state wasn't doing anything, why would anyone want independence from a state that didn't exist? And it strikes me that chattel slavery obviously involves coercion and force. If there was no state, how did this happen? The second sort of interpretive model, the subaltern studies mode, or post-colonial mode, says that the empire was just a vehicle of extraction, transferring wealth from indigenous people to Britain, can't explain the creation of relatively inclusive political institutions, or why former British colonies are wealthier than former colonies of other empires. Think just the contrast between Jamaica. You might not think of Jamaica as fantastically wealthy, but then if you look next door to Haiti, it looks awfully wealthy, right? So why this sort of puzzle? So let me talk a little bit more about these modes. So in recent literature, and here on the left is a book called Outsourcing Empire, written by an economist and political scientist. The right, The Company State, written by a historian. They make the sort of same kind of argument that Britain had a very weak imperial state, and it was really run by companies. So the argument, as advanced by Phillips and Sharman, that company states pioneered the defining institutional features of the modern corporation that helped to underpin the architecture of contemporary capitalism. Company states, they say this is not a quote, I'm paraphrasing, were successful in creating early modern empires because they were more flexible than traditional states, and because, unlike states, they necessarily focused narrowly on generating returns for their investors, and thus were far more efficient. That is to say, they were responsible to their shareholders. They were therefore far more efficient than states, and that's why early modern empires were formed by company states in this view. In the 18th century, the company state had more autonomy in South Asia than it did in North America because of the distance, right? I mean, so the argument is yes, there were companies in North America, but they didn't have autonomy from the state because they were too close to Britain, too close to Europe. Consequently, Britain gained an efficient empire in India in the 18th century because of limited state intervention, and it lost its empire in North America because of state interference. The problem with that is that it can't explain why some parts of the British Empire in North America, not run by a company, remain part of the empire. That is, Canada, for example, or Jamaica, the Caribbean, nor why the company required state cooperation at crucial moments in South Asia, right? It wasn't an East India Company army that defeated the Mughals at the Battle of Plassey. It was a British army. It was the British Navy that defended the independence of the various British presidencies from attack in the First and Second Anglo-Mysore Wars. Second interpretation, and here I'm putting, consciously a certain amount of putting things together that people might not think of. So on the left, you see George Bancroft's History of the United States, which you might not think of as having much in common with Partha Chatterjee's The Black Hole of Empire, but to my mind, they both partake in a similar narrative that empires were inevitably going to be replaced by nation states. And the problem with the British Empire is that it was an empire. Empires are an inferior form of state organization compared with nation states. And this kind of argument is being maintained not only by the Subaltern Studies crowd, the Subaltern Studies Collective, but also, interestingly, in political science by the History of Political Thought crowd associated with that other British university called Cambridge. So their whole notion is that empires were extractive states. They define an imperial colonial power as a state that goes around the world with the aim of taking other people's real estate or other people's resources. You will be surprised to know that this comes not from actually Don at Cambridge, but from Donald Rumsfeld. But it's the same view that's been deployed both by post-colonial theorists like the Subaltern Studies Collective and by political theorists trained in the Cambridge School mode. So the only alternative to empire in their view is nationalism. So Chatterjee said it was nationalist resistance was the inevitable response to the British Empire. Now, I think there's a lot of problems with this account. So Americans argued in the Declaration of Independence, not that they rejected the British Empire, but that, and this is, I quote from the Declaration, the history of the present King of Great Britain, George III, is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. So obviously in this statement of the Committee of Five that wrote the Declaration of Independence, there was no tyranny, according to them, before George III came to the crown. So it wasn't empire that was tyrannical, it was George III who was tyrannical. So the focus was on the political failings of George III, not on imperial structure. In South Asia, the British succeeded in replacing one empire, the Mughal Empire, with another. While nationalism may have informed the creation of India, Pakistan, and eventually Bangladesh in the 20th century, none of the resistance to British rule in the 18th century, i.e. the Anglo-Mysore Wars, etc., the Maratha resistance, was fought in the name of the nation. There was no nation which they thought they were defending. And I want to point out that even within post-colonial studies, there's a robust tradition that says this empire that raises questions about the empire to nation-state narrative. And I'll just want to remind you that Edward Said, famously a critic of empire and Orientalism, also wrote essays warning of the dangers of nationalism. He insisted that resistance to Israel, for example, shouldn't be formulated in terms of the nation. National thought, or thought that is cast in national and essential terms, always produces loyalty, patriotism, and the tendency to fabricate excuses and conditions for suddenly turning liberal principles into a species of irrelevant and jejune footnote. The competitiveness and bloody-mindedness of the exercise have not always been up to, and this is, you can see, remember Said's dripping sarcasm tones, up to very high standards of decency or concern for human rights. Others have pointed out, besides Said, others have pointed out that nationalism has produced far more violence in the 20th and 21st centuries than empires did. And this is the argument that Burbank and Cooper make in Empires in World History. I mean, they're not post-colonialists, it should be said. So the stories told strike me as insufficient. The company-state story that there was a superior form of political organization was the company rather than the state, which was more efficient, strikes me as deeply problematic. And the empire to nation-state telos, that empires were an outmoded form of political organization that need to be replaced by the nation-state, also strikes me as empirically problematic. We talk about an American empire. I know that's controversial. I think less controversial, perhaps, is the persistence of other empires in the world today. So I want to take a different approach, what I see as within the field of comparative empire studies, and to place the British Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries in comparison with other empires. And the reason for doing this is to take empires seriously is that empires lasted for a long time and persisted as a state form, suggests that most people in history have not perceived it as either as less efficient than private companies, and that empire's persistence suggests that it did not necessarily lose the evolutionary struggle with the nation-state. The amount of death and destruction created in the name of the nation-state also suggests that we think hard about its ethical superiority. That is to say, in the early 20th century, everybody was confident, like Woodrow Wilson, that nation-states were ethically superior to empires. After the Second World War, after various other things that have happened in the world, it's not clear to me that that ethical case is a slam dunk. What is an empire? So I want to get beyond condescension and nostalgia, right? I mean, there's cheerleaders for empires like my friend Neil Ferguson and many detractors of empires. Asking whether empires are good or bad doesn't strike me as a social scientific question. It might be an interesting question, but not a social scientific question. I want to think about what are empires, and I want to sort of start by saying that empires have been the most common state form in human history. One thinks of the Roman, Chinese, Egyptian, Byzantine, Mongol, Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, Aztec, Inca, and Comanche empires, among others. And most of these empires, not necessarily the Comanche, lasted a very long time. So what is an empire? So Charlie Mayer said, empires are extensive sovereign state forms which acknowledge and govern actions across and through difference. Krishan Kumar, a sociologist, says, empires are state forms designed to deal with some of the most difficult and challenging problems of modern states, how to manage difference and diversity. Burbank and Cooper make a very similar definition. So empires are states, right? They're states, we need to think of them in that family, which govern across difference. They're to be contrasted with nation-states. So rulers of nation-states insist that they govern a culturally and ethnically homogeneous group governed by a single set of laws. Now, most governors of who think they're governors of nation-states are, they're fully aware that they don't actually govern a homogeneous population, but they argue that that's the ideal. That's what they should be governing over. Only full participants of the nation should have full rights. Now, that said, I want to insist that empires are not uniquely violent. So, I mean, there's a very robust literature on the violence of empires. That literature is not wrong. Empires are violent, right? But so are all states, right? So Charles Tilly famously said that war wove the European network of national states, and preparation for war created the internal structures of the state within it. Now, my late friend Jim Scott has described the destructive human and natural toll of modernist state formation in the same sort of way. So there's a kind of agreement broadly that the state formation itself is a violent act, and so empire as a subset of the state form, understandably, will be violent. I also want to insist that the British Empire was not uniquely or particularly violent in the period of its formation in the 17th and 18th century. So the historian of China, Peter Perdue, my former colleague, has placed the expansion of the Qing state, the Chinese empire in this period, the early modern period, as part of a global process. He's absolutely right. Nearly everywhere, Perdue notes, newly centralized, integrated, militarized states pushed their borders outwards by military conquest, and settlers, missionaries, and traders followed behind. Now, I'm not necessarily convinced of the sequence of that, but the ubiquity of the violence and empire state formation in the early modern period, he's certainly right about. In this respect, then, the creation and expansion of the British imperial state was a variation of a global phenomenon. So, the emergence of the British imperial state has, I'm going to talk about three phases. First, Ireland as an essential testing ground. Now, I want to insist that it's a testing ground, not, as some scholars have insisted, the model for the British Empire, but actually a testing ground which revealed the central problems in British imperial state formation. Second, I want to insist that partisanship and empire in the British case were co-constitutive. Party politics emerged as a debate about how to best govern the empire in the British case. Finally, an imperial pattern was established in the 17th and 18th centuries, which persisted through the period of decolonization. I am insisting that there is no such thing as a first and second British Empire, but in fact, British Empire as a phenomenon which rose and fell. So Ireland. So I want to argue that Ireland was a failed imperial possession. Now I'm going to abbreviate here what is the subject of a fairly long chapter, but just want to sort of summarize the argument. So in 1541, there was a constitutional revolution in Ireland. This is an argument that was made famous by the Irish historian Brendan Bradshaw, that it was in this period in 1541 that English ceased to try to make Ireland part of England. Right? Up until then, Ireland was described as a lordship, in other words, a subsidiary, potentially a subsidiary of England. Instead, from 1541, Ireland was designated as a kingdom within an empire. Right? Those of us trained, long ago in English history learned that, at the Protestant Reformation, Henry VIII declared England to be an empire, and then people said that, and then said, okay, by the way, that's kind of interesting, ha ha ha, they used the word empire, and then jump away from it. My point is that made sense only because Ireland was turned into a kingdom as part of an empire. So King Henry VIII ruled Ireland not as Lord of Ireland, which he did before 1541, but as King of Ireland, at the same time that he was King of England. But between and of course Ireland had its own parliament. That was part of this. But between 1541 and 1641, the English failed to develop a political economy for Ireland that could work. In other words, a way that they could pay for governing Ireland. Conquest failed, right? Conquest succeeded and failed, right? It succeeded in the sense that Hugh O'Neill and the Earls fled to the continent. They left Ireland, but at the cost cost of 3 times the annual budget of the English treasury, right? It was bankrupting England. So they succeeded in conquering Ireland, which meant that the leaders went away, but at costs that they couldn't sustain. Then they tried plantation. They tried plantation settling English people. There were all sorts of problems. The English didn't want to go. Those who did go didn't find it profitable. And in 1641, there was a rebellion in Ireland which destroyed the plantation system. So in the aftermath of the Irish Rebellion and then the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in 1650s, even the Cromwellians who went to Ireland on the grounds that they were going to try to protect the plantation system argued that Ireland needed to be placed in the context of a broader empire. Plantation would never work. You could never make the Irish English. That was the conclusion that the Cromwellians took. Now, so Ireland could only prosper as being part of a broader empire involving the Atlantic and perhaps the East Indies. So the political economy about how to pay for this new, sovereign invention, which came in 1541, became the central question. Second, the emergence of party and empire. After Ireland was made part of the empire rather than part of England, and the English failed to devise a sustainable way to finance their new colonial possession, the English began a debate on a broader scale about how to fund an empire. The issue became far more acute in the 1650s, not only because of the Irish situation that I described, but because they conquered Jamaica in 1655, Barbados in the 1640s and 1650s, because of the so-called sugar revolution, became profitable. And they managed to consolidate both Virginia and New England into what was then the English Commonwealth. Now, during this period, the British Empire was distinctive as opposed to other European empires. The British imperial state, unlike its rivals from the 17th century, was the subject of widespread popular discussion in the British, Irish, British Isles and across the empire. So what do I mean by this? So in the 1620s, newspapers started to be published in England. In the 1620s. In the 1640s, there was a massive explosion of newspaper publication in the 1640s and 1650s. That continued, and then in the early 18th century, newspapers began to be published in Ireland, in the English provinces, in Scotland, in places like Massachusetts, in Virginia, in Jamaica, in Barbados. Even Nevis and St. Kitts had their own newspapers already in the early 18th century. This might seem like, oh, wow, so what, newspapers? Well, the first newspapers weren't published in the Spanish Empire until the 1790s, and no newspapers were published in the French Empire until very, very late in the 18th century. I should say, I forgot there were also newspapers published in India. We used to think that the first newspapers published in India were in the 1780s, and I think I talked about Hickey's Gazette in the read ahead. I've recently discovered there was actually a newspaper regularly published in Bombay from the 1670s. And these were, and the nature of the empire was discussed not only in newspapers, but in journals, that is to say magazines, pamphlets, ballads, drama, and novels. They were published and circulated all across the empire, and these publications were absolutely not localist, right? If you read the newspaper in Spanish Town in Jamaica, it didn't report on what was going on the sugar plantation in Clarendon Parish. It reported on what was going on in London politics and the mayoral elections in London, what was going on in North America, what was going on. I mean, they reported on the Battle of Plassey, in which the British took control of Bengal. All of this was reported on in the Jamaican press, right? So it was an imperial press, not a Jamaican press. The British Empire, so it was distinctive in that way. It was also complex. Dissonance rather than consensus characterized the British Empire. There was no unifying ideology of empire. There was no single empire project. Different groups within England and throughout the empire had different ideas about how to make the empire work and what the value of colonies should be. The disagreements began to coalesce into identifiable parties by the late 1670s, and groups began to call themselves Whigs and Tories. Although it turns out one of the things I've discovered recently is that the first people who called themselves Whigs as a political grouping occurred not in England, which I used to think, but actually took place in Tangier in the 1670s. Tangier, by the way, was a former British, we forget that Tangier was a British colony in the 17th century, but it was an English colony. So party politics shaped the empire. Different political parties had different visions or models of what the empire should be, its value, and who should benefit from it. So the contours of the imperial partisan debate. First group, one group, let's call them Tories, they called themselves Tories, we should call them Tories too, said that the empire should benefit the English landed classes. The purpose of empire was so there was this, increasingly there was this big national debt. National debt meant paying high taxes. The purpose of the empire was to pay down the national debt and to lower the taxes on the landed classes in England. Its economy, the empire's economy, should be based on territorial acquisition and colonial extraction. The empire should be administered centrally and should have unified sovereignty, and socially the supporters of this vision tended to be the English landed gentlemen and colonial elites whose position was threatened by social, cultural, and economic changes in the regions, right? I mean, so these were the sort of great Tory supporters of empire. So, I mean, famously in North America, one thinks of Thomas Hutchinson, which my former advisor, Thomas Bud Balin, wrote I think very effectively about. So that's one group. There's another group that I call the Whig Patriot group, and then increasingly over the course of the 18th century, they call themselves patriots. And obviously, I'm making a point here. There was something called the Patriot Party in Britain. So when Americans, revolutionaries, called themselves patriots, they were not talking about defenders of America. They were identifying themselves as part of a pan-imperial political party that was well established. So from their perspective, empire should benefit all of its subjects. Now, they didn't all agree about who counted as its subjects, but they should benefit all the subjects of the empire. It should be based on capturing markets rather than territory. They wanted the empire to be confederal rather than centralized, so they rejected notions of unitary sovereignty, and they described the British Empire as a federation. So federalism was not an American invention, nor was it, a Swiss invention, as some have said recently. It was an invention, was sort of widely discussed strategy for governing. Socially, the group drew heavily on the English manufacturing classes, that is to say, both people who owned manufacturing firms and people who worked in them, on colonials, both settlers and locals who benefited from imperial economic networks. So imperial trade was increasingly central to Britain and its empire. So by the 1660s, overseas, and here mostly imperial trade, was the most dynamic part of the English economy. So throughout the 17th and 18th century, the growth sector of the English economy was overseas imperial trade. The landed sector was more or less moribund. I mean, you could make 2%. Was a really, really good year of returns on land, whereas people were making, 8, 10, 12% from overseas trade. By the 1670s, taxes on overseas trade formed the greatest part of the English state revenue. And I should say, I'm sort of flitting back and forth between English and British here. I'm quite, know that England is what I'm describing before 1707, before the Anglo-Scottish Union of 1707. Britain is the proper thing after that. So that's why I'm flitting back and forth, because I'm talking about both both the 17th and 18th centuries. So the greatest part was involved taxes on imperial commodities, right? Sugar, rice, and tobacco in the 17th century. By 1700, imperial trade had begun to surpass European trade as the greatest element of English-British trade, but they were already tied by 1700. But the imperial trade was growing much faster. So the empire was vital to the health of the English-British economy and, more importantly, to the British fisc. And here's my little graph. This is just to show you that they're already tied in 1700, and look, imperial trade over the course of the 18th century becomes more important. Third, imperial patterns were continuous through decolonization. There was no first and second empire. So ideological debates about how best to govern the British Empire that emerged in the late 17th century formed the institutions that conditioned the response to global developments in the late 18th century. It is impossible to explain why Britain lost its colonies in North America and gained a larger, more wealthy empire in South Asia without understanding these institutions. These institutions similarly shaped developments in the 19th and 20th centuries. The American Revolution, to my mind, didn't mark the end of the debate, but rather the end of a phase of the debate. So there's assumptions of discontinuity everywhere. So arguments from a fundamental shift from a first to a second British Empire, for example, advanced by John Derwin, and those of for a global transformation of the world order, advanced by Boozin and Lawson, in the 19th century are both based on flawed assumptions about the earlier period, right? They know a lot about the 19th and 20th centuries. They don't know much about the 17th and 18th centuries, and they tell stories that people in the 19th and 20th century told about the 17th and 18th centuries, but they are stories that should be treated like Grimm's fairy tales. Well, maybe one should treat Grimm's fairy tales with more respect. They're more interesting. These are the sort of books. So one of the claims is the market only began to be globalized in the 19th and 20th century. But in fact, modern research and such minor thinkers like Adam Smith and Karl Marx, they didn't agree on a lot, but this they absolutely agreed upon, was that globalization as a phenomenon began to gain steam in the later 15th and early 16th century, and the fundamental phase shift in economic history took place then. That was the fundamental transformation, and I think a lot of economic historians have begun to confirm that sort of argument. Another claim is no state in the 17th and 18th century, at least in Britain. Only in the 19th century do you get a state that's capable of governing an empire in this sort of new sort of way. But it strikes me that it strikes me that part of the reason the misunderstanding has to do with Charles Tilly, who was brilliant, really brilliant in many ways, but Charles Tilly's story about state formation was a telos about the forming of national states, right? He says national states, right? But in fact, most states being formed were imperial states. If one thinks of these states not as European entities, but as imperial entities, rational state formation in the 17th and 18th century was extremely robust. The British imperial state was extensive and strong, but it was even stronger if you include imperial state structures. In fact, Britain spent a far higher percentage of its treasury in the 17th and 18th century on its colonies, on Ireland and on Scotland, than it did on England for various complicated reasons. So the myth of salutary neglect is another one of Grimm's fairy tales. Another claim is that there's a shift from a first to a second British Empire because new ideologies of progress only emerged in the 19th century. In fact, debates over empire in the 17th and 18th century were debates between competing stories about how best to promote progress. One emphasizing territorial expansion to benefit the metropolitan English landed classes, the other emphasizing the possibility of infinite production based on labor and consumer demand, but both were arguments about progress, fundamentally about progress. don't have to wait till the 19th century to think about progress. Another claim is that there was a shift from consensus to compromise. The claim is that in the First Empire, there was a single imperial project. In the 19th and 20th century empires, the Victorians were capable of debate, which clearly the Hanoverians were incapable of. Another nice story, if only it were true. It would make my research a lot easier, but in fact, there were deep divisions in 17th and 18th century period, and partisan debate pervaded not only Britain, but one of the things that I insist upon is that partisan debate pervaded each and every colony, and that partisan debate was intimately related to partisan debate within England, so there was, within Britain more broadly. So, I mean, just to sort of summarize this, just sort of give you an example, there were patriots in Ireland in the 18th century, right? Lots of Irish historians have written about patriots in Ireland. There were patriots in Jamaica in the 18th century. A few Jamaican historians have written about patriots in the 18th century. Most Jamaican historians write about the 19th and 20th centuries for some reason. There's a very clear reason, because the Jamaican archives don't get really robust until the late 18th century. So the point is that there were partisan debates throughout. There was no pivot from an empire of settlement to one of conquest. The stereotype is that the English had colonies of settlement, think Massachusetts, before the American Revolution, and conquest afterwards, think India. But the English stroke British conquered lands from Indians in North America, right, in the 17th century, right? I mean, there was something called the First and Second Pequot Wars, which were involving conquering lands. From the Spanish in the Caribbean, Jamaica, from the Dutch in Indonesia, Bencoolen, and from the Mughals in India before the American Revolution. And the British settled much of Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada after the American Revolution. Settlement and conquest happened in both periods. Finally, there were debates over the nature of sovereignty both before and after the 1770s. The assumption that only in the modern era could the British imagine sovereignty as something other than unitary, only in the modern era, and here I'm sort of citing the famous British historian Lewis Namier, who said the British Empire, there would have been no American Revolution if the British in the 18th century could have conceived of the modern notion of empire. Of course, he was writing, this was his undergraduate prize thesis. He was writing in the early 20th century. He didn't imagine decolonization, but he was thinking about notions of federal empire associated with the Round Table Group. Of course, those sorts of arguments were exactly the arguments that many British Whigs and patriots advanced in the 18th century that claimed that the British Empire should be properly understood as a federation. This was the view espoused by the Irishman Henry Grattan, by William Pitt the Elder, who happened to be Prime Minister, Benjamin Franklin in the famous Albany Plan, and the British Secretary of State and journalist Joseph Addison. Notions of imperial confederation associated with the Round Table and advocates of the Commonwealth, of course, persist today. So why then did the Americans lose an empire? No. It's the British who lost an empire in North America. Maybe the Americans did, but that's more than I know now. Anyway, the British lost an empire in North America while they gained one in South Asia. So the answer, simple answer, Tories gained power in Britain through elections in the 1760s and 1770s. They rejected the notion of federal empire based on exporting manufactured goods to colonial consumers and capturing world markets. That is to say, that was the view espoused by the previous Prime Minister, William Pitt the Elder, whose government fell in 1761. And instead, they embraced a vision of territorial empire in which the colonies served the interests of the English landed classes and were used to pay down the debt. What did that mean? Taxes, right? They started taxing America. We've heard of the Stamp Act. We've heard of the Townsend duties, right? Especially here, right? I mean, Pat Griffin has written very helpfully about the Townsends and their duties. All of these sorts of things, and this new form of taxation in America pissed off people in North America. But it's also important to understand what the British were doing in India. They gained the Diwani in 1765, which was the right to tax India on the grounds that it would generate £2 million a year to pay down and balance the national debt. So when the Tories were faced with having to choose in the 1770s and 1780s between their saving their massive wealthy empire in South Asia, and one forgets, we know about Lafayette, right? We know about Lafayette supporting the Americans. What one forgets is that the French sent a lot more money and resources to support the Mysore regime, Hyder Ali to defeat the British in South Asia. The American Revolutionary War, there was a war being fought in South Asia at the same time there was one being fought in North America. The British decided it was far better to send their navy to protect India than to protect Cornwallis in Virginia. We know what happened at Yorktown as a result. But the British did defeat Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan in the Anglo-Mysore Wars. They kept India at the expense of North America, but it was a calculation by Tories because they were interested in paying down the debt, and India could provide far more resources to pay down the debt than North America. So, bottom line is, I see there as having been a recurring and imperial civil war. Now, my story about what I just said about what's going on in India and what's going on in North America suggests already that the American Revolutionary War should be understood as an imperial civil war. If I add into that story the struggle of the volunteers in Ireland going on at the same time, that's a further part of the imperial civil war. There were struggles going over control of the Caribbean islands at the same time, and there was a radical agenda within England itself to overthrow the Tory regime. Some called for a revolutionary movement, and when Lord North did resign from office, there was a purge of the British civil service, which makes the stuff that's happened the last week in this country seem like nothing. Seemed like total peanuts, right? It was a revolutionary transformation of the government. So it was an imperial civil war, but it didn't just start in the 18th century. There was a struggle between territorialists and commercialists, between Tories and Whigs, fought all over the empire, beginning with Kegwin's rebellion in Bombay in the 1680s, over a fight whether Bombay should be a free port to penetrate Indian Ocean trade or should be the bridgehead of a territorial empire in South Asia. And there was a struggle in Tangier over whether it should be a free port or a beachhead for an African territorial empire. So that in the 17th century, but there was certainly a crescendo in the imperial crisis of the 1770s and 1780s, fought in South Asia, North America, the Caribbean, Africa, Ireland, and South America, because what we've forgotten is how much support Britain gave. We normally think about the Tupac Amaru rebellion as some, indigenous rebellion, and it was that in part. But Britain gave huge support to Tupac Amaru. The British government did. The number of memoranda about Tupac Amaru far outnumber, at least what I was able to find in the archives in Seville about the Tupac Amaru rebellion, and that's because the British were supporting it whole hog. And it didn't end in 1783, 1784. Commercialists wanted, in the 19th century, the legacy of the Patriots was to create an empire based on free ports, just as Bombay had been a free port. The idea was in the 1760s, there was a plan to make New York, Charleston, Kingston. Well, they did make Kingston into a free port. It was a free port empire. In the 19th century, there was a free port empire. Cape Town was created as a free port. In the late 18th century, there were debates already to establish a free port in the Malay Peninsula, which eventually manifested in the creation of Singapore as a free port. They were discussing creating a free port in the South China Sea, which became Hong Kong. And of course, Sydney was imagined as a free port, and Halifax in Nova Scotia was also to be understood as a free port. Versus the territorialists like Henry Dundas, who wanted territorial empire and no free ports. So that's all I have to say. I did want to say, maybe I'll say one thing about what the larger implications. First, the American Revolution was not a nationalist rebellion against foreign rule, but an uprising by American patriots in alliance with Irish, English, Scottish, and Caribbean patriots against Tory rule. It was part of an imperial civil war. Second, Taking empire seriously means reconfiguring international relations into interstate relations with no sharp break in the 19th century or the 20th century, which allows us perhaps to expand the data set for analysis backwards 3 centuries, a lot more data. And finally, it suggests that we should reconceive state formation and stories about state formation away from a bellicist model in which wars drive the formation of states, which then drive different kinds of political outcomes. That's sort of a summary of Tilley's story, to one in which states are formed with already existing commitments to political economies and perhaps notions of political participation. In other words, I don't think it's true that wars make states and states make war. I think it's true that state formation is necessarily violent, but the violence of state formation is associated with different social strategies, which one might call partisanship. That's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Professor, for taking the time. I grew up reading more pop histories of the early British Empire in India. And in that, I think there's a sense that the East India Company operated in a situation of anarchy, that the agents were able to do whatever they wanted, and the metropole didn't really have much power to guide policy. And that seems much more different than after 1857, when the crown formally established itself. So how does your argument fit into that changing amount of how much the metropole could control India?
Yeah, I mean, it's a standard. I mean, it's not just pop histories, right? I mean, this is a story. Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe William Dalrymple is a popular historian, but that's his claim. And John Wilson, who's absolutely not. I mean, you know, John Wilson, an old friend, you know, professor of imperial history at King's College London. That's the argument that he makes. This story of anarchy in South Asia in the 17th and 18th century is lazy. I think it's true to say that it's a complex story, right? I mean, the Mughal Empire after Aurangzeb had tough times, right? I mean, it was invaded. Delhi was sacked in 1740. And there was an emergence of successor states. And even during Aurangzeb's rule, there was a growing power of, say, the Maratha, whatever you want to call the Marathas, a confederacy under Shivaji. So I mean, it was being threatened. So territorial boundaries were fluid, trade routes were constantly being made and remade, but that wasn't anarchy. It was a struggle. I mean, it would be like saying, there was anarchy in Europe during World War II. There was conflict in Europe during World War II. I think you could easily say that, there was a German state doing various things in Europe during World War II. And I think one can similarly say there was a British state doing various things in South Asia in the 17th and 18th century. I mean, there was also a French state doing various things in South Asia in the 17th and 18th century. There was also a Mughal state which was still trying to do things, and there were various successor states of the Mughal Empire also doing things. And there was, I mean, my view is that there wasn't so much anarchy as competing imperial projects. It was a moment, the period largely from the 1680s to the, straight through the end of the 18th century, is a moment in which there was competing imperial designs on South Asia. And I think what one needs to do to sort of make clear what's going on is to actually go through the administrative sources. I mean, what I've done is go through the administrative sources on the British side, but I've also been relying on work being done by colleagues and friends working on administrative sources on the Dutch side, on the French side, and my colleague Muzaffar Alam looking at stuff on the Mughal side. Yeah?
Would you say that the British government in the metropole had a lot less influence in what was happening in the 18th century as compared to the 19th century in terms of policy?
No, I wouldn't. So, I mean, look, I think 1857 marks a sea change in the governance of British India, but it's a sea change in the policies being pursued rather than its capacity to affect things. I think that what was the case in the 18th century was that there were many other powerful imperial stakeholders in South Asia. So in that sense, I mean, if you just sort of blindfolded threw a dart in the map, in the 18th century, you might well hit a part where British had no influence because that was an area under Maratha control or under Mysore control or under French control or under Dutch control. But that said, I think the areas under British control, the British state did have a huge amount of influence. They organized the way trade took place. They arbitraged currency in a variety of ways. The amount of state control was significant. It doesn't mean it was infallible. There were things that they couldn't do that they tried to do and couldn't do, but the same was true in the 19th century, and the same was true in the 20th century. I mean, that was, a point which the Congress Party made, quite well, is that not only are the British doing bad things to us, the Congress Party said even the things that they were trying to do, which might have been good, they weren't doing very well because, there were limitations on their power.
Hello. What is one discussion that you remain unresolved on? So something that historians continually debate about this era that you're still figuring out an answer, and what are the different perspectives on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you. I mean, for me, one of the biggest puzzles that still remains is, why did the British and not the French, not the Spanish, and not the Dutch implement participatory political institutions, right? I mean, there were assemblies in British North America, everywhere except for Quebec, right? I mean, right, famously, right? The Spanish didn't have assemblies. There were no popular assemblies. There were audiencias, right? I mean, there were forms of governance which worked incredibly well, but they weren't participatory political institutions in the same way. The French had no participatory political institutions in Canada, or slowly late right before the Haitian Revolution, they began to develop some participatory political institutions in Saint-Domingue, but very, very late in the day. The Dutch, despite an incredibly robust tradition of political participation, there was no, there was nothing the equivalent of a Dutch vroedschap, right? I mean, the elected town council in Batavia, right? I mean, that's Jakarta, modern Jakarta, right? Batavia was the center of the British Empire. No, none of these sorts of things. It's one of the great puzzles that we don't really have an explanation for. And it's not something, it should be said, I'm interested in comparative empires. I'm very interested in the way that contemporaries talk about comparisons. That's not a question where there's a robust discussion in the 17th and 18th century literature, right? There's an observation, right? There's an assembly, right? There's an observation saying, and in fact, the French merchants in French Canada talk immediately. if you read the correspondence of French merchants after the conquest of Quebec, after what happened on the field of the Plains of Abraham, they're writing nonstop about, what's really interesting about these British guys is that they have assemblies. We'd like one of those. Be really good. We don't have one of those. Don't have a tradition of doing that. And then it's the people who petition complaining when the Quebec Act is passed, which says there will be no assembly in Quebec. The first set of petitions that arrive in Britain are from the French, right? Is the French the French merchants say, we were happy to join your empire after the conquest. Not that we had much choice, but we were happy to do this because we thought we were going to get this nice political institution called an assembly so we could have commercially friendly things. And by the way, you also promised us English common law. What is this crazy idea of keeping French civil law in Quebec? So they're aware of this, but I don't think we have a really good account about why. And somebody should write a dissertation on this. Somebody should write a senior thesis on this.
Thank you. This is a great talk. So for at least the last 60 years, political scientists have said that Americans are extremely ignorant about politics, that levels of political knowledge in the United States are extremely low. Now, the explanation that they give is people just have other things to do. Like they have lives to live. Like politics is not in the forefront of their minds for all sorts of reasons. And I wonder, what's your explanation for the existence of pan-imperial knowledge in the 17th century British Empire? Is it exactly the same claim, but in reverse, where you had to know if you were a British subject in Jamaica, what was going on everywhere else in the empire? Like, how do you explain this existence of, what looks like to be a widespread political knowledge of the empire? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean that's a terrific question, and here's my materialist functionalist assumptions coming, laid bare. Yeah, I mean I think what ended up happening is that if you were a planter in Jamaica, right? Planters in Jamaica where you had 1,000 slaves working on your plantation, right? In not the best conditions, right? They're dying of disease, they're being beaten. There's a reasonable chance that those slaves are going to rebel. And you are a planter. Yeah, you might have 10 guys working for you, and they might have guns, and the slaves might not have guns, but 10 guys with guns versus 1,000 slaves, they're not going to win, right? So they needed to know that there was the possibility of, during a slave rebellion, which happened quite regularly in Jamaica, that there was going to be support from the state, right? So they were very anxious to find out how well supported was the British Navy, how big of an army was there that could be repositioned to put down something like Tacky's revolt in Jamaica in the 1760s. So they had an interest in doing this. So that's a negative way. But they also, I also want to sort of say that if you were a merchant, let's say if your name was, if you were a merchant in Massachusetts, you knew that your profits, your export trade, was dependent on lots of things. The value of British currency, supported by the British state. You knew that you were dependent on a British Navy that was going to protect your exports and imports coming to and from Europe, to and from the West Indies. You knew that your sale of goods within Massachusetts depended on roads being built, and most of the money for those roads being built from Massachusetts came from the British Treasury. So you needed to know how likely these things were going to happen. So people were obsessed with these sorts of things. And I'm struck by, I've gone through thousands, well, hundreds at least, of merchant letter books. And, merchants are guys who are interested in the bottom line, guys and women. It should be said there are a lot of female merchant letter books written by women in 17th and 18th century, that you would expect them to be interested in the bottom line. And sure enough, right, they talk about the cost of indigo, they talk about the cost of tobacco, they talk about the different prices in markets, et cetera, et cetera. But what's surprising to me is that the amount of space in these merchant letter books, right, that are and a lot of them form official parts of business archives, how much they talk about politics, right? Now, there might be reasons now why you wouldn't talk about politics, right, in your email correspondence. There might be reasons now why you might not do it, but my sense is most of the guys and women who are involved in business, spend a lot of time thinking about the bottom line, especially as sort of lower down. But what's remarkable to me is that, I was struck by, one of the things I looked at one point was, the letter books of a small-time Quaker weaver in Leeds. Small-time guy, and I was expecting to find interesting information about Yorkshire, right? But instead, he goes on and on and on about protests against the Stamp Act in Massachusetts. He goes, there's a sort of a huge paragraph talking about the granting of the Donnelly, which he spells Deewanee, right? So what's remarkable to me is that this guy's a small, right? He's not doing, he's not actually involved in any form of international trade, but he sees this as being vitally interesting to him because of the ways it might affect his sort of stuff. I don't know if that's fully, I confess, it's a kind of quasi-materialist, functionalist explanation, but I really do think that it mattered, the empire mattered to them in very profound ways.
Thank you for your time. David Canadyne's Victoria's Century, his 19th century history of the British Empire, at times seems to make the argument that a lot of acquisition during the century was quite decentralized. At times, individuals would essentially present an area as a fait accompli to the imperial center and say, we've got it, what else are we going to do? In the read ahead, you talk a little bit about institutions generally across the empire, but I'm interested about how centralized the empire was in the imperial center. So maybe moving past the Indian case, can you tell us a little bit about how centralized acquisition was in the 18th, 19th centuries generally? Thanks.
Yeah. So I'll put my cards on the table. I think the world of David and his wife Linda Colley, I think they're very great historians. I just disagree with them about just about everything. I think they're very sensible. I think David's book, Ornamentalism, was an extremely important provocative response to Edward Said's Orientalism. I think they're both wrong. I think both Said and Canadyne are wrong, but I think it was an extremely important contribution allowing the debate to move forward. So that's my obligatory be nice. There are two things that I want to say. One is, it is not the case that the British state in the 17th century or the 18th century or the 19th century could control everything that various people on the edges of empire could do. It couldn't. It simply couldn't. The same could be said about a lot of 20th century empires. What they could do is they could decide whether to accept the acquisition or not. And those issues were frequently debated, right? To give you one example from the late 18th century, a little bit after the period that I'm sort of talking about, Britain, in the aftermath of the American Revolution, decided to settle this place called New South Wales, right? The whole idea of settling New South Wales is, we're going to avoid all the mistakes we made in North America. What was the biggest mistake we made in North America? Cities. Allowing cities. That was a really, really bad mistake. Where do these kind of people who object to the Stamp Act, where do they mostly come from? They came from horrible places like Boston and New York and Williamsburg. We need to avoid cities. So what are we going to do? We're going to create New South Wales, a place with settled by convicts. We'll send the convicts there. We'll give them a little bit of land. And they would all have the land. They would live on the land, and they wouldn't congregate in those horrible places called cities. And they would become loyal Brits. Now, a bunch of radical merchants, some of them not so radical, decided, no, actually the real value of New South Wales is not conquering this land which seemed to them like a desert, but to use Sydney as a base to penetrate the very wealthy trade of the South China Sea. So they established a city called Sydney. The British government debated this, so what are we going to do about this? Are we going to wipe out this settlement called Sydney? You know the answer. They decided, no, we'll support Sydney. It will become the capital of New South Wales. And they decided, now part of this was about a partisan debate about what New South Wales was going to become, but they were reacting to what people did on the edges of empire. Now, just as often in the 18th and 19th centuries, they disowned what people did on the edges of empire, right? They couldn't control everybody, and in a lot of cases, they ended up punishing them, right? Just like in the 17th century, Sir Walter Raleigh had his head separated from his body when he didn't do what James I said he should do, which was not try to settle in Spanish-American territory. So, mean, it's not that Raleigh didn't do these things, right? I mean, Raleigh was a great man. He did all sorts of things. He was able to do all these things. He didn't do them at the behest of the English state, and the English state decided to disown him. And I think the same pattern occurs throughout, right? I mean, that there are people who do various things. You know, we tend to focus on the places that the British took advantage of what, you know, whatever you want to, cowboys with a small c did on the borders of empire. But there were many more cases where the British state just said, you know, that was bad. We're either going to punish you if we can capture you, or if we can't capture you, we're not going to let you back in, right? And we're not going to recognize what you've done.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us, and thank you again for making time for breakfast with the wise women. So you mentioned Quebec earlier in the Québécois, and you know, they still have a separatist party, and there is still somewhat of a separatist debate. So with the increasing globalization, increasingly rapid communication across distance, and just sort of broader evolutions in major powers, as well as the dissolution of these colonial empires taking place between the 17th century and today, how do you think the difficulty of succeeding in an independence movement or a popularly supported allegiance shift has changed between the 17th and 18th centuries and now?
Well, let me just say, everything I'm going to say in answer to this question is going to be a little bit speculative. I'm a historian. I know the archives. I know the people of the 17th and 18th century very well. But look, my view is that in the 17th and 18th century, most resistance to empire was not taken in the name of nation state or nationalism. Most resistance to empire was taken in the name of alternative preferable empires, right? And one can think about this on a variety of scales. One thinks about Pontiac's rebellion. Pontiac didn't say, you know, we're Pontiac's rebellion, right, in you know, near in what is now, you know, just north of here, right, Michigan. Pontiac didn't say, I want to get rid of British imperial control in favor of creating some sort of nation. Pontiac said, I would like to be part of a different empire. A Six Nations empire was basically what he said. Now, there was a long period, I think, in the 19th and 20th centuries, or increasingly in the late 19th, 20th centuries, where resistance to empire was almost invariably fought in the name of nation. But I will point out that that even somebody who was as bitter of a critic of the British Empire as Eric Williams, who wrote Slavery and Capitalism, right, famously, but was also Prime Minister of Trinidad, right? He warned of the dangers of nationalist rebellion, right? I mean, he had intense debates with the French anti-colonial theorist Aimé Césaire, right, who talked about négritude as an concept of, you know, black nationalism. And Eric Williams said that's not the way forward. That will lead to new forms of oppression. And Eric Williams sort of argued that what should succeed the British Empire in the Caribbean was a Caribbean confederation, right? Not not an idea to sort of invent some sort of notion of nationalism, but forms of confederal argument. And he argued that, that confederation was an alternative to empire, although late in life, as I discovered when I looked at his papers, he also said, well, actually, my notion of confederation is fairly similar to what the British Roundtable guy said. It's just I'm thinking about it for the Caribbean rather than for Britain. So I think one of the big changes is a move away from alternative imperial resistance in favor of nationalist resistance. But I also think, and I think that persists. I think that persists today. But I think increasingly people are talking about the potential dangers of nationalism in the nation state as being the only alternative to empire.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed the paper and was very thought-provoking. I want to try to clarify in my own mind two concepts. First of all, when you talk about continuity between the two empires, you mean continuity in the sense of it's the same terms of debate about the empire across the two of them, right? But what varies is which side of the debate. Okay, that's pretty clear. It's the global empire thing that I spent the weekend wrestling with. And I felt like I dropped into your apartment in Hyde Park, and you and the ghost of Louis Namier were arguing. And I didn't quite I couldn't get clear in my own mind exactly what you were arguing about. Part of it was global empire. I mean, on the one hand, global empire, you can cut out the global. It's duplicative. But you mean something by that. And I can see, given your description of the Whig nationalist position, a globalist sort of sense, at least the way we understand it in modern terms. But then you say the Tories were also globalist in a sense. And here's where I had the problem distinguishing between you and Namier. First of all, the Tories liked the empire because it was good for the English gentry. That doesn't strike me, at least from my modern 21st century view, as particularly globalist. It's global in the sense that you're taking advantage of people around the globe, but not globalist in the same sense that the Whig argument would seem to be.
Yeah.
And then secondly, I don't know. I know Namier's name, but I don't know the debate that you're into. But it seems to me that one could see the Tory position as being redolent to the smoke-filled rooms and peculation and things like that in a way that would make perfect sense. Now, it could also have a political cast to it as well. And so can you help me understand the global empire concept? Because I think I'm not getting it.
Yeah. Well, I think you did get it. I think you got it. I mean, let me sort of say two things. Let me say, maybe I'll say three things. First thing is, you're absolutely right to say that the Patriots and the Tories understand global differently, right? So, I mean, the Tory position is the only way for us to make the empire work is for us to get territory and to get resources. Now, through most of history, most Tories said they needed to gain more territory, right? They also had an element of intensification of extraction, right? I mean, so it's not just more territory. But absolutely, their vision of the global is the global serves the English landed classes, are increasingly in the 19th century, they describe the British, after the Anglo-Irish Union, they talk about the British landed classes, and, you know, I mean, the sort of, the Irish derogatory epithet of West Britain, you know, I get what political work it's doing. It's all sort of recognizing that the Irish who worked with the British Empire were also gaining from this global empire in that way. They were West Britons in that sense too. So I think that's absolutely right. Whereas I think the Patriots are much more interested in globalization the way we mean globalization today, right? I mean, but I think the worst reason why I'm comfortable using the word global is because their vision, neither group, neither the Tories nor the Patriots had a parochial vision. Neither of them were focused narrowly on Britain and Europe, or narrowly on the gains to be made from industrialization, because they knew that the gains to be made from industrialization on the Patriot side depended on markets, global markets, right? So that's the sense in which I think both of them think non-parochially, non-Eurocentrically. They think about the world, and they think about the way the empire globally works. And I think you're absolutely right to say that what they mean by global is very different, right? I mean, that's absolutely part of my argument. Smoke-filled rooms. I make no apology for politicians. Politicians of all political parties at all times, to me, strike me as having elements of corruption, depending on how you define corruption. I don't deny that that's the case. What I do think is that, and this is where I disagree with Namir, is that I do think even whatever corruption, peculation, et cetera, usually there's a larger ideological project going on. And you can peculate along the edges of those, of that project the way you want. So I think there might be smoke-filled rooms, there might be all sorts of dirty tricks which are going on, but what I'm trying to say is those dirty tricks, they're contained within, they might be limited, they might be in the service of, but they're contained within these sort of broader ideological projects. So Namir, let me just sort of say, Louis Namir, I think is, to be honest, I think he was one of the great innovative thinkers of the 20th century. Namir, just to say something briefly about him, Namir was an East European Jew, sort of. He certainly lost his faith, who studied with Pareto of Pareto optimality when he was a student in Switzerland. He then moved, for reasons having to do with his father's business, to Britain as a kid, was educated in Oxford of the early 20th century, and became certainly one of the most influential historians. What I know, what most of my peers know about, is Louis Namir wrote this famous book called The Structure of Politics at the Accession of George III, in which he denied that there was partisanship in Britain. His argument was that there was a fundamental consensus among the governing classes in Britain about how the world should work, and that therefore, while there was, political division was always about place, or as he said, making a figure. It wasn't really about ideas. There was no debate about ideas because the governing classes in Britain all shared the same ideas. Now, it's been said by my friend Quentin Skinner that Namir denied the importance of ideas in politics, but that's clearly not true, because the other half of his career was trying to explain the ideological origins of Nazism, right? He thought ideas really mattered. It's just ideas didn't matter in the 17th and 18th century, and he had, to my mind, a coherent sociological account. His notion was partisanship happens when you get rapid social and economic change. And his argument was that there was no rapid and social and economic change in Britain or the empire until the Industrial Revolution. So partisanship in Britain first in the 19th century certainly exists because the Industrial Revolution, Industrial Revolution spreads everywhere else. You get partisan politics because of rapid social and economic change. Very coherent story, just wrong, right? There was rapid and social and economic change in Britain in the 17th and 18th century, and as a result of rapid social and economic change, there was partisanship, and the English landed classes did not all share the same ideas. They spoke the same language, quite literally, that they did do, but in that language they disagreed about just about everything, and those disagreements were institutionalized in partisanship. So that's sort of. But I will say, reading Namir is a treat. He's somebody. It's one of those things where you read Namir and you realize he's writing with Marx in one hand, Freud in another hand, and Weber over there, and everything that he writes is in a dialogue with the. So he's unbelievable. I mean, he's an unbelievably good reader of Marx and a critical reader of Marx, but I think he really understood Marx in the way that many, I'm afraid, Marxist historians or Marxist scholars have not. I thought he was a really good reader of Marx. I think he's part of psychology plays a huge role in his story. I think he's a very sophisticated reader of Freud. I mean, which is not surprising. I mean, he hung out with Freud's daughter in London and was very close to him, and an incredibly good reader of Weber. He's also a good reader of Durkheim, but he wasn't. I mean, the Durkheim stuff only comes in later on when he tries to explain the ideological origins of Nazism.
I like the paper a lot. It seems to me that what you're talking about is, when you're talking about political difference and political disagreement here, it's a lot, and it's based a lot on who benefits and who benefits how and how they do that. And almost the resistance across the empire is designated, and it attains its identity on the basis of a taxonomy of who benefits and who doesn't, and how that shades out. Now, I love materialist, functionalist arguments, and I tend in that direction myself. First question I'm going to ask is the difference between Tories and Liberals, or Whigs. And I'm very pleased that this partisanship is, you're positing it as intrinsic to the empire and very important. But we're used to it in ecclesiastical debates.
Yeah.
So and this guy that you were talking about, this Leeds Quaker, who's so invested, I'm wondering to what extent ecclesiological and debates and churchmanship are projecting themselves upon a view of the empire, are projecting themselves into attitudes towards Creoles, towards settlers, towards subalterns, all of those things. And then as time goes on, because certainly you can read that in relation to attitudes to Ireland, in relation to attitudes all over the place, in relation to attitudes to people who are heathens and differing views there. And then later on, this seems to be layered on, maybe in the 19th century, but concerns about race. And I'm wondering also when race comes into here and how that pans out differently.
Yeah, no, great questions. So, okay, I'm going to sort of tell a very narrow empirical story and then sort of spin it out to the first question. Then, the answer to race is a sort of less interesting answer, but I'm happy to sort of make clear my position. You're absolutely right. Of course, Whigs and Tories emerged in the late 17th century as descriptions of religious groupings, right? Whigs were Whigamores, right? Literally from Whigtown, right? I mean, for everybody. I'm just sort of explaining to everybody, right? People, sort of fire-breathing Presbyterians who would have nothing of any form of religious toleration, would have nothing of any attempt to create Episcopalianism in Scotland, would certainly have nothing to do with Catholics in Scotland, right? And so this was a derogatory term associated with people claiming that the Whigs were, religious extremists, fire-breathing Presbyterians, or I don't know. Yes, that was a sort of claim, a certain kind of Presbyterianism, and Tories were, Catholic allies, right? In Ireland, right? And I think that I think it's fair enough to say that in the late 17th century, those religious associations had meaning. I don't think they were dispositive ever, but I think they did have meaning. I think it was, Tim Harris and Mark Goldie have shown in different ways that, Whigs were more likely to be Protestant dissenters, Tories were more likely to be faithful communicants in the Church of England in England. All of that is true, but something fundamentally interesting happens in the last 2 decades of the 18th century. So the first Tory prime minister after the Revolution of 1688 is Robert Harley, who came from an impeccable Presbyterian family in the west of England. One of the two most important leaders of the Whig Party in the early 18th century, Sidney Godolphin and John Churchill, came from high church Episcopal families. How do we explain this puzzle? Well, the argument that I make in the book is that in the 1690s, political economy ended up surpassing religion as a predictor of party allegiance in England in the first instance, right? In England in the first instance, but this then, I can tell the sort of story that this ended up mattering very much in Scotland, that one should sort of try to explain why it was. One of the things that frequently gets written out of the history of the 15, the Jacobite Rebellion in 1715, is the extent of Presbyterian support for the Catholic Jacobite pretender, right? Not centrally part of the story, not centrally part of the popular history, actually socially extremely important. And so the argument was, the argument had to do that these guys weren't happy, these Presbyterians, mostly merchants, weren't terribly happy with the extractions post 1707 of the British state, and particularly extractions that were being made after the Hanoverian succession in 1714. The taxes went up on these guys. They ended up joining the Jacobite cause. So I think the sort of religious associations end up breaking down because political economy, and I think you can trace this. I have traced it in Robert Harley. Robert Harley, came into Parliament initially in the 1680s as a Whig. Everybody called him a Whig, right? But by the 1690s, he's a Tory, and he becomes Tory Prime Minister. And one can trace his evolution based on his activity on the Committee of Accounts and his attitude toward taxation, right? He gets very, very upset that William starts raising the land tax, right? And he then starts making new alliances. When the Bank of England was created in 1694 by John Locke and his friends, basically, Harley tries to create an alternative bank called the Land Bank, right? Where you can only deposit money based on landed mortgages, right? And his alliances, in doing this, he turns to some of his old friends, right? They're Baptists who support him, but a lot of his allies in the creation of the land bank are Catholics and high church Anglicans, right? And so my point is that religion ceases to be a great predictor from that point onwards. And I think one can tell a similar story, for example, about the emergence of the Patriot Party in Ireland, that it turns out that there's an attempt by the Patriots in Ireland in the 1720s, for example, to make alliances with some of the Catholic aristocracy to try to overturn, Connolly's control of the parliamentary party. So there are weird bedfellows, and Connolly, starts making friends with Presbyterians in Ulster in all sorts of ways. So I think things become unstable, and I think religion becomes less important as a predictor. Now that said, I think there's no question that one could look at particular localities, as some 19th century historians have done, look at who the supporters of the Whigs or the Liberal parties are in Lancashire in the 19th century. And yes, in Lancashire, you see a high correlation between dissent and liberals, right? But I don't think that's globally true. And I don't think it's wrong, but I think that's why one needs to look at localities, but then try to figure out to fit all of the different localities together. And I think the connective tissue is more political economic than it is confessional, granting that it was more confessional in the 1670s and early 1680s. Second question about race. My story about race is a very simple story. I think race begins to have meaning as a political term in the late 18th century. So it's not that, I mean, I think that, Shakespeare wrote about, Othello, right? It's not that people were unaware of physical characteristics, right? It's just race wasn't a category that had standard meaning. And one of the remarkable things that I find in descriptions of enslaved people in Africa is that, if you actually look at the letter books of some of these slavers, they don't think that the black guy who's selling slaves to them is an inferior person. They think he's a good businessman, right? And that changes, I think, in the late 18th century, and I think that sort of story, I think I see it politically, but it fits with the kind of story that the intellectual historian Sylvia Sebastiani has told.
All right, well, let's all thank Steve Pincus for coming out.
Oh, sorry. Sorry for going on too long.